Good to be here, folks. My name is Keyvan Esfarjani, and I'm with Intel Corporation. I'm responsible for Intel's global supply chain, manufacturing, and operations. Folks, the purpose of the talk, you all know of Intel. Intel, makes computer chips, and of course, the key topic in everybody's mind is, supply chain these days. And I want to start by, let me see if the clicker moves forward. Folks, can you move the clicker? If you move yes, very good. So, folks, I like to maybe start with just give you a little bit of a context. This is a tech conference, and as you all know, every aspect of our lives, if you are, using, let's say, computers, you're using cars, you're using refrigerators, you're using anything that today that we are utilizing, what do they all have in common? They all have semiconductors. So if you believe that the world is going to continue to go more and more on data, they all need semiconductors. And in fact, how are these semiconductors made? They're made in fabrication facilities. They are very, very, hardcore science and technology processes that goes into building these devices. And they take a lot of, investment to make it happen. So over the last couple of years, if there's one lesson learned, is having a resilient supply chain is more critical than ever before. Because, our lives all depend on data these days, and they all need semiconductors. So if you don't have this critical element of what really runs our life, the world can come to a halt. So what we learned is that there is, challenges that we are facing, and if you look back at, if you go to the next slide, we had actually few number of issues that actually hit us pretty hard in the last couple of years. First and foremost is, we learned that the balance of the supply chain is critically important. And when one element, if you're concentrated into one area of the world, right, when it comes into anything that you depend on, and that element of the world gets a disruption, then you know what? The rest of the world basically gets impacted. And semiconductors are not immune to that. And I want to give you a little bit more context about that. The second part of this is, of course, the pandemic, right? You have manufacturing these products, these semiconductor devices. I mean, think about, these are, you start with the fabrication. These are chips that are made on wafers. They're shipped all around the world because once you build them on the wafers and they go into what we call assembling them, then we have to test them, you have to package them, and then eventually they go into the end products. Those end products could be PCs, they could be products that go into data centers, it could be products that go into cars, all the way from the leading edge processors that support the artificial intelligence, high performance computing, to the most basic devices like power modules, 10, 20, 30 cents parts. So when all of this is sort of concentrated, right, into the manufacturing, either one region or the world support, and the world gets hit with something like pandemic, right, these things get impacted. And of course, the last part of this is just the overall, geopolitical situation. When, there is risks of certain, countries or places where, the raw materials and the supply and the factories are basically concentrated. If there is a situation, and we saw this unfortunately with the situation in Russia and Ukraine, and other parts of the world where there could be conflicts, these things could also impact us. Why is this important? This is a tech conference, and everything you see, folks that are presenting here, it depends on data, and data needs semiconductors. So it's very, very critical that we take a step back, and Intel as a company is really taking upon a critical responsibility to move this forward. So if you go to the next slide, please. So why is this important? And when I talk about the resiliency of the supply chain, today, more than about, I would say, 80% of the chips that you use, doesn't matter what application, whether it's for airplanes or cars or for computers, right? They're concentrated in Asia, Korea, Japan, China, Taiwan, right? So, and this was actually quite opposite. If you look back 20, 30 years ago, right? In fact, semiconductor was really invented in the United States. And the concentration of this supply chain, share of the world for what was getting supplied was about 80%, US and Europe, about 20, 30 years ago. So over this period of time, right, you can see that the shift in the supply has caused this very imbalance of this situation. So if there's one lesson we learned from a couple years ago, it's very critical that we have this balance of where the supply is coming around the world, so that if there's one shock in one element, like what we saw last couple of years, whether it's pandemic, whether it's the shutdown of the ports or airports or the Suez Canal or you name it, right? It's not going to bring the whole world, the economy down, bring people out of jobs. So what are we doing about it, right? And that's where a leader, a company like Intel, is really working with partners all over the world in order to enable a solution here. So if you go to the next slide, there are really three key levers that we are looking at in order to really drive the solution here. First and foremost is you got to balance the supply chain, right? If your factories are all concentrated in one region of the world, that's clearly not okay. The second part of this is as you're solving that problem, you're bringing on the new capacity, right? You got to do it right. You got to do it with sustainability. You got to bring it up with responsible execution against the environmental requirements. And of course, lastly, is not just the investment, it's not just the capacity, it's not just building the factories, it is also bringing on the skills. It's the people. It's really driving those the talent that you need in order to enable this industry. So we have limited time, but I do like to give you a little bit of a flavor of what each of these sort of mean. If you go to the next slide, starting with the balancing of the supply chain, can you click to the next slide, please? We have a bit of the clicker here. Okay, here we go. So what Intel has done, and we have operations all over the world. Of course, as I mentioned, the way we produce chips, it starts with the wafer. Those are our major fabrication processes. So you see in Oregon, Arizona, New Mexico, we announced the big expansion in Ohio recently, big expansion in Germany. We have a major operation here in Ireland, and I'm really proud some of my very colleagues are here. And of course, we have operation in Israel. So each of these fabrication facilities for leading edge process technologies, how much does it cost? About $20 billion, right? Each of these boxes that I'm showing, and even more depending on the technology. So as you see that for helping to support this balance of this supply chain, it requires significant investment. And not only the fabrication where you're making the wafers, you're also going to need to build the back end of the process, which is where you do the assembling them. You dice up these chips from the wafer. So very, very critically important that putting the foot forward in order to make the right level of investment needed in order to support the capacity that is needed in order to all of the folks here, everybody around the world who are driving innovations where they need data, they need artificial intelligence, they all need semiconductors, okay? So first, is balancing the sort of the geographical balance of the supply chain. That Intel is taking a step forward, and we're absolutely committed. And as you notice, also the focus of Intel's investments is really in two regions, United States and in Europe, right? And this is very much consistent with the actions and the announcements that we have made. And if you go to the next slide, I want to now talk about the second part of what it takes to build a resilient supply chain. And it's really around three key areas. Building these semiconductors, building these chips, requires a lot of water usage. And of course, it also requires, we have a lot of waste. By waste, we mean, chemicals or solid waste. And of course, it also has, the carbon emission. Now, Intel, for the last, 3 decades, has been very much focused in this area. In fact, Intel is a leader to drive sustainability. As you're bringing up all this significant capacity, we just saw in earlier, you add up those, boxes, and there's more to come, more than $300 billion in the next, 8 to 10 years. Intel is putting its foot forward in order to drive what the industry needs for leading-edge capacity. But you got to do it right. And when it comes to water, scarcity of this resource, today Intel recycles its water more than 90%. The goal by 2030 is to be 100%. And this is investment, innovations that's put in place that every drop of water being used is recycled back either into the operation or back to the municipalities. The second part of this, of course, is circular waste, right? Today, all the waste that's being utilized, these wafers being made, right? More than 65–70% of that is recycled for repurposed for other uses. Again, goal for all of this is to essentially get to full circularity. And also we announced that by 2040, achieving a net zero emission. That means, the CO2 being zero. That's the net zero goal by 2040. These are audacious goals, these are ambitions, this requires investment, this requires innovation, all the way to the basics of the science and technology of what it takes to achieve that. So it's not just building the resilient factories and the supply, but it's also doing it right. And that's what Intel is pursuing forward. If you go to the next slide, the third pillar that I talked about is also talent, right? You're bringing up all this capability, it needs to start with the grassroots efforts, all the way from K through 12, kindergarten. This is the pipeline of building these chips requires to really push the science and technology. Everybody knows what's Moore's law, right? Doubling the number of transistors every about couple years. This is economics. This is what drives the whole semiconductor industry. Gordon Moore was one of the founders for Intel. So the technology innovation in semiconductors is an unstoppable trend. And with that, you need the innovative mind. And that starts from K through 12. Also, the skills that you need in order to enable this semiconductor industry is all the way from technicians with a couple years of degree of basic understanding of statistics and reading charts, statistical process control, all the way to PhDs and postdoctorates, right? So this skills enablement, all the way from quick start programs or partnering with the local communities, is also very, very critical to enable this. In fact, Ireland, we have more than €1.5 million a year where we contribute and support the local communities in order to just support the pipeline of talent. We announced $100 million for some of these projects, like Ohio, where we announced that we're going in these regions. So as you go to these new regions in order to build the chip industry, the semiconductor industry, you have to make sure that you're enabling the talent that goes with that. And of course, the last part of this is you got to make sure that you have the skills in the right places, right? And enabling the ecosystem, as I mentioned, is really critically important. So Geographically, so if you look back at the things I say, if you go to the next slide. So you got to build the factories. You have to make sure that you're doing it right. And of course, you got to make sure that you build the talent that goes with that. And this is going to also require to have strong partnership. This is not something that Intel just does it alone. And places that's required is, with all the ecosystem, all the partners, all the suppliers, the places that Intel is going, that I just mentioned, with focus in US and Europe, right? The second part of this is private and public partnerships. We are very encouraged with the support of the European Union as well as the US government, the bipartisan support there, because building this ecosystem enablement is not something that's just all that Intel can do. The infrastructure, the power, the water, the education, you name it, all these things requires very, very strong partnership between the private and the public partnership. And of course, lastly is the whole ecosystem, the technology ecosystem, the automation, the manufacturing, material suppliers, all come together in order to make this happen. The one thing that's very, very exciting is that the growth for this area is going to have a tremendous opportunity for not just the new sort of talent coming in, but also enabling new business models, new disruptions, where the data is really powering the future of the world and the industry. So with that, I want to conclude, and if you go to the next slide, really thank you all for your attention. This was only 25, 30 minutes of just giving you a little bit of a flavor of what it means to really drive the semiconductor, balancing of our supply chain. And being in charge of this for Intel, you know that Intel is behind this, as well as we are putting our actions where our mouth is, and it's going to be a very, very exciting road ahead. So with that, I want to thank you all for your time today.